Hi, I'm Isaiah Cox. I'm a Mormon pioneer, a frontier settler, and a St. George temple builder. Let me tell you my deep story. I was born on May 18, 1839 in the Ozark Mountains in Missouri. My parents are Jehu and Sarah Cox. Both were born in Kentucky. They were Quakers but embraced Mormonism a year before I was born. We moved from our Ozark farm to Adams County, Illinois, just south of Quincy to join the Gathering Saints. We lived here for 2 crop cycles. In the spring of 1842, we moved 3 miles south of Nauvoo, Illinois. We were devastated by the death of Joseph Smith. After the harvest of 1845, we moved into the town. In 1846 my parents were endowed in the Nauvoo Temple, and shortly after we left west as Mormon pioneers. We crossed the Mississippi River on May 20 and spent the next 2 years between Iowa and Winter Quarters, Nebraska. My older brother Henderson volunteered at 16 to go with the Mormon Battalion. We never saw him again. He was murdered at Tragedy Springs in California. In 1848, by the Platte River in Nebraska, my 6-year-old sister Lucretia was run over with the wagon and died. Today, her name is listed at the Pioneer Children's Memorial in Salt Lake. We traveled with the Haber C. Kimball Company on the Mormon Pioneer Trail to Utah. I was 9 years old and the journey was 129 days. No toil nor labor fear, but with joy wend your way. We arrived in the Salt Lake Valley and eventually settled near Cottonwood Canyon. My father had 40 acres. There was some violence between the Indian and Mormons in 1853, so our community built a 10-acre fort on my parents' lot called Union Fort. I helped build it and kept night watch. Today this is east of Hillcrest High School and is the origin of the road named Fort Union Boulevard. We got to know those in the fort very well. I met Henrietta Janes at Union Fort. We married on January 1, 1856. I was 16 going on 17, and she was 20 years old. Our first daughter Henrietta was born 11 months later in the fort. In 1857, we were fearful that the large U.S. military force of Johnston's army had been sent to annihilate us. We made preparations for defense. I joined a local militia led by Lot Smith. I was a Rough Rider cowboy in the Mormon Rebellion. We went to Echo Canyon since that was the main passage from the east. We set fire to 52 wagons that had army supplies. The wagon master said, "For God's sake, don't burn the trains." Lot Smith replied it was for God's sake that I meant to burn them. A few weeks later at Ham's Fork, we drove 1,400 cattle away from their army with our wild yells. We came close to dying at this event. We eventually gave back 800 of them. Their army stayed at Fort Bridger for the harsh winter. We feel we were successful in delaying their entry into the Salt Lake Valley. After the Utah War, President Buchanan eventually offered amnesty to us. In exchange, the Army would be allowed to establish a permanent fort nearby at Camp Floyd in Cedar Valley. By 1858, the Salt Lake Valley was getting too populous, so we moved away for more land in Fairfield, Utah. I am listed as one of the 16 founders of Fairview. My son Isaiah Jr. was the first child born in Mount Pleasant. In 1961, after Julia was born, I received a mission call by Brigham Young on a cotton mission to relocate my family to St. George, Utah. I was the only son of Jehu who received this call, so we had to say goodbye to my family and friends to start over again. We were among the first settlers of St. George. You can find my name as one of the St. George pioneers on this plaque. In those days we called it Dixie. I was an expert carpenter. I did the skilled workmanship at the St. George Tabernacle. I had the privilege to place the ball on the tower of the tabernacle, like the cherry on top. In agriculture, I assembled a reaper. I was the first with a horse-powered grain thrasher in Washington County. In 1965, I started living polygamy, which I believed was a higher level of marriage. I married Elizabeth N. Stout, daughter of Hosea. Henrietta gave full consent. 4 years later, I married Martha Cragen as well. We tried to live our home life like the United Order, founded on character, integrity, virtue, and charity. We tried to live in harmony with God's teachings. My wives lived together peaceably and they loved each other. In 1871, Brigham Young came to town and proposed the St. George Temple construction. I was overjoyed by the prospect of having a temple close and also for the promise of employment. I helped build the St. George Temple. We finished in 1877. In 1876, Mr. Blackburn came through town promoting the investment of the Grand Gulch mine. I took out a loan of $700 to invest. It was a complete loss after he took the money and ran. I was scammed. I still paid back my loan in full. In 1884, I was called on another mission to colonize the Lower Muddy in Nevada. One wife came with me. I was called as bishop in the local congregation. By 1887, I was back to St. George. Here is my cantaloupe shed. By 1887, times were rough due to the new anti-polygamy laws. Henrietta moved to live with our daughter in Rockville, Martha moved to a small mining town in Nevada, and Elizabeth went somewhere. A family council was called, and we decided for me to leave into Old Mexico for safety, where John Taylor just bought land. None of my wives wanted to go. They were all settled with the children. It was decided to take another younger wife. With the full approval of my wives, I married a fourth wife in 1888 named Mary Jane Millett. I was 49 and she was 23. We had 4 children together. I married a fifth wife that same year to Sophia Morris, who was 19 years old. This marriage didn't last long and ended as a failure. We returned to St. George, Utah in 1892 from Mexico, where I spent the last 4 years of my life. I was a typical pioneer man. I had versatility and a native ability as a general utility man. We had fruit, grapes, and melons. Along with carpentry, I worked as a wheelwright. I would build a wagon out of native material. I also could do some work as a blacksmith. I joined civic committees to improve streets. I also planned roads, public buildings, and schoolhouses. I helped to raise funds for school books, maps, building repairs, and heating. I fostered socials and plays. In 1896, shortly after Utah's statehood into the Union, I had a serious accident where I broke my leg. We were coming from the field on a load of hay when the wind blew the load of hay over. Within 2 weeks, I passed away on April 11th. I left behind 22 living children and 28 grandchildren. I had 9 children by Henrietta, of which 6 lived to adulthood. Elizabeth had 7 of 8 children live to adulthood. Martha had 5 of 8 children make it to adulthood. All 4 of Mary's children survived. Here is the record of my funeral service. My tombstone is St. George City Cemetery in beautiful southern Utah. Come give me a visit next time you are in town. I'm Isaiah Cox. I'm a Mormon pioneer, a frontier colonizer, and a St. George Temple builder. Thank you for listening to my story.